Welcome to the Talking Precision Medicine podcast, brought to you by Genialis. I'm your host, Raphael Rosengarten, CEO and co-founder of Genialis. On this podcast, we discuss the future of healthcare and health technology, and how advances in data and data science are fueling the next industrial revolution. Please subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for more information on Genialis and our unique approach to AI-driven precision medicine, please visit our website at www.genialis.com. That's www.genialis.com. Now, on to the show. Welcome, everybody. I am super excited today to have Stéphane Budel, the founding partner at DeciBio, which is a precision medicine consultancy. Stéphane, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
Stéphane and I were just chatting. We actually have a lot of people and places in common in our history. We both studied at Yale, but I want to start in the present, maybe work backwards. Tell us what DeciBio is all about and what you guys do today.
Sure. So DeciBio is a strategy consulting firm with a mission to accelerate the adoption of precision medicine. And we believe that the current healthcare system is largely a sick care model, and we're passionate about shifting that to a more proactive, personalized care model. We are quite different from other strategy consulting firms in the sense that we also have a number of data products that we offer, and we also have an actual venture arm where we invest in small companies and technologies. So that enables us to be industry participants as opposed to simply advisors. And we think it's important in the space of tools and diagnostic for precision medicine because you do need to understand innovation and find a way to work with these small players, which is much harder for some of our competitors who only offer consulting project in a 6 or 7 figure range.
So you do strategic consulting and you have data products and a small venture arm. So it sounds then like you're working with everyone from the newest companies to some of the biggest, but if you're able to name names, great. If not, who are the kinds of clientele you advise? Like what is the kind of strategic advisory that a client would seek out from you?
No, absolutely. So we work with startup all the way to Fortune 500 companies. And if we actually look at the workflow in precision medicine, you have the tools providers. So companies like Illumina, Thermo Fisher, 10x Genomics that offer instruments and reagents, right? And they offer that to people who do basic research, as well as people who actually offer diagnostic tests. And so the diagnostic test providers are companies like LabCorp, Foundation Medicine, NeoGenomics, and we also work with the actual diagnostic providers. And finally, we work with pharma companies as well. So especially the ones that are most advanced in terms of their adoption of precision medicine, such as AstraZeneca. So we work with all of these different type of players. And the type of services that we do for them go from very basic voice of customer research all the way to go-to-market strategy.
Yeah, I want to come back to the go-to-market strategy, especially with regards to pharma. But since we're discussing the company, maybe we can spend a little bit of time on the origin story. You know, how did you decide to take your training in life sciences and biology and point it in this direction?
Yeah, so coming from Switzerland, one thing that was amazing for me coming to the United States is how entrepreneurial people are. And when I was in the lab, I actually started a few companies with friends in the lab, in a street matter lab. And so I knew that entrepreneurship and starting companies is something that I had an interest in. And I went to work at LEK Consulting for a couple of years. Ultimately received an offer to join one of our former clients, like Life Tech, their genomics division. And my wife actually convinced me to rush an application to Illumina because I always talked about Illumina. And I applied there to the business development group, Jorge Velarde, Craig Harris. I made it to the final rounds and they picked the other guy. But they called me and said, do not take the offer from LifeTech. It's clear you love next-gen sequencing. We'll get you a job here in 3 to 6 months. So I started DeciBio initially as a placeholder, thinking I'm going to do this for 3 to 6 months and then go get a job at Illumina.
And what year was this placeholder?
That was 2009. So it's been a while. So I did that as a freelancer, very much as a freelancer for a few years.
Right.
And a few years later, 2 of my former colleagues at LEK joined me because they said, hey, you know what, we want to try something different as well. And this is when it really started to take off. Between the 3 of us, we started to hire people. And now we have 4 offices, 50, so out of 50. So we have 45 employees, 6 partners. And as I said, it's been a fun ride.
Wow, so that's 16 years. Yeah, quite a placeholder. So the passion for Illumina and the stuff, I'm gonna guess because you and I were at Yale at the same time. Short read sequencing was invented just up the road in Brantford. Did you get to play with that when you were a student?
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. As it turns out, so my thesis advisor knew Jonathan Rothberg. And so I got a chance to use the platform, the next-gen sequencing platform from 454 before it was even commercialized. And so this is when I realized, wow, this is a lot of fun. This is actually quite amazing. And when I worked at LEK, because I worked I had a chance to use this platform and nobody had at the time, I was being staffed on all of these projects that were, in that space. And, it definitely stuck with me. We don't have to get into the philosophy of it, but to some extent, it actually mapped to some of my personal beliefs. I have like a very strong about, if you look at the why, and you ask questions multiple times, well, ultimately, I have like this very a strong faith in science. And I also am a determinist. And so if you're a determinist, you think, well, where is it that decision is being made then if we don't have free will? And I do believe that you can actually have and go all the way back to the blueprint, which is DNA. And obviously then the environment actually act on your DNA and make modification at the protein level in order to drive our actions. But there is something about really understanding the DNA that I feel can really help us understand a lot of the way we behave.
No, that's fascinating. I don't honestly know if I think I'm a determinist or if I believe in free will. I haven't examined it that closely.
You should take a look.
I should. I'm gonna spend the whole afternoon now scratching my head. But my journey was similar. And when I was in grad school, I had come in from sort of the evolutionary biology, marine biology side, which was my passion. But I wanted to understand why, and that's why we started sequencing. Yeah, say the same reason. I think you and I latched on like this technology, the short reads would let us truly understand mechanisms.
That's exactly right. And it's the scale at which it has progressed over the last 2 decades has been nothing short of amazing. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I don't think people really appreciate how much effort it was to sequence the first genome and how now we can sequence tens of thousands of genomes in, a couple of weeks. It's just remarkable.
Did you know Chris Mason when you were at Yale? Do you remember Chris?
Of course, yeah, we're in grad school together. I know Chris really well. He's a good friend.
Yeah, and a good friend of mine as well. So Chris was the guy who got me into short read sequencing. He's the guy who never slept, right?
Yep.
So he'd come home from the lab at 3 in the morning and insist I come over for a whiskey or two or six or whatever, right? And we would just brainstorm what kind of companies could we start with this technology. We were going to do racehorse genetics. We had all these crazy ideas, like
I'm sure nothing's changed. So one of the best ideas that I heard, like in a very, actually, I don't know if it's idea, but there was one thing that I thought was fascinating in 2012 or 2014, maybe when the MinION came out. I thought it was incredible that you can have now this sequencer in your pocket and you can go anywhere. And I called a friend of mine, his name's Ken Bachman, who was at the time, I believe in Japan doing his PhD. And he told me, you know what we need to do? We need to start a company where you actually sequence tuna. And if you can actually find a genetic signature for why a piece of tuna is going to be worth $100,000 versus $300,000, people would pay thousands of dollars for that test. And this is just like one of the example of what could you do if you could understand, complete, very complex phenotype at the genetic level. And I still think it's a good idea, actually, as it turns out. But yeah,
I think it's a great idea.
kicking around funny ideas is something that I always enjoy doing with with Chris or with anyone.
Yeah, no, and I just feel like every group of scientists, every cohort has their technology that's oh wow, we could do something new, right? And so, if you think about it right now, maybe it's even AI is the thing in that moment. But recently we've had CRISPR, right? We've had CRISPR and technologies like that. And for me anyway, it was the opportunity to sequence at depth that
Yeah,
was that moment.
I agree, and I guess we can talk about AI some more. I'm also extremely bullish on AI, and I think in ways that we have really no idea what's going to be coming next, right? So my mom actually worked at CERN. She really wanted me to become a physicist, and when I became a biologist, she was like thoroughly disappointed. I may as well have told her that I was going to study astrology. And what's funny is if you look in the very early days of the Big Bang, and by very early days, I mean years like 380,000 or so, is when there was this event called recombination, where the universe actually stopped being opaque. There was already particles floating around, but there was no electrons. And, we had all of the right particles, but the information really couldn't travel quite easily. And then this recombination made it transparent. And this is when we actually started to be able to have like the particles the way we know them, galaxies started to form, et cetera, et cetera. And in the same way, I think this is where we are right now with precision medicine. We're still very much in the soup. And there is all of these particles that everything is very siloed. But as soon as this recombination is going to happen and we can tie it all together, I think we're going to enter a world that we just simply can't imagine right now.
That's exactly sort of what I wanted to poke at next is since you've been thinking about precision medicine now for, well, at least 16 years professionally and probably more scientifically, I love the astronomy analogy, but describe to me maybe concretely sort of where are we in terms of the arc of precision medicine? Where were we 20 years ago, 10 years ago now? And then maybe we can keep looking into our crystal ball and seeing where it's going.
Yeah, so I think it's in the 90s, right, that precision medicine was first born with Herceptin and the HER2 tests. And so it's really only around 30th year old. So we are 3 decades in. But in my mind, we're still very much, if you look at the technology adoption curve in the innovator portion of that curve, I think we are in the first inning. We probably 2 or 3% penetrated. And if you look in, another 1 or 2 decades, we're probably going to start to name precision medicine just simply medicine, just simply like this idea that we would actually take any drugs in ways that are not somewhat tailored to a genetic makeup is not going to be making any sense. So I think we're still absurdly early, even within oncology, which is the area that has like the most adoption. Like precision medicine today is very much precision oncology. So I think, as I said, 2 or 3% in.
For those of us who aren't, nose to the streets on this, why is oncology where precision medicine has the most, the biggest toehold? Why is it most mature there?
Yeah, so people like to say that the cancer is a disease of the genome, which is very true. Is that whenever you have mutation in your DNA that make your cells start to divide in a way that's uncontrollable, is essentially what happened in oncology. So you can actually look, there is a very close link in oncology between genotype and phenotype, right? Like ultimately what's happening in terms of outcome for that patient, very much tie into that one mutation that you can have in one gene. For example, when you look at if you develop a mutation in the EGFR receptor at position 790, when you would go from T to T790M, what's going to be happening here at the protein level is that you're going to develop resistance to a drug called erlotinib, right? And so it's amazing that like one single piece of mutation in your DNA is going to change like the outcome of a drug that you take for cancer. So that's like reason number one, is the fact that, there is this very close link because the disease of DNA is cancer. Reason number two is that it's a very aggressive disease. And as a result, there is a lot, and a disease that affects a lot of people who have money.
Affects a lot of people, period.
And so exactly, people care. And people will vote to make sure that some of the funding is actually allocated to this very aggressive disease that's very deadly, where you need to act fast. And so as a result, there is a lot of pharma funding. And that's probably like some of the key reasons are probably those.
I want to take a moment and sort of distinguish a little bit the two different approaches, and I think they're similar, but when we talk about precision medicine, one of the ways that manifests is by developing tests, right? Diagnostic tests, so that you can know something more about the patient and then maybe give them the right therapy. Another is what you alluded to, those this idea of tailoring therapies to the patient's disease specifically. Can you maybe differentiate between these two approaches a little bit? One of them I think of more as precision medicine, as the diagnostic guided approach. One I think of more as personalized medicine, which is the drug itself is now tailored. But maybe maybe I'm using the wrong terminology to separate these two ideas.
No, I think those are the right term. I think essentially what happened is the reason why we renamed personalized medicine precision medicine. I think it's because there is a lot of cases in which you can have entire population or cohorts that would benefit from the same therapy if they have the same diagnostics. And so, we didn't want to scare investors in some sense, thinking that, well, now you're gonna have an N of one for everything you do, right? It's just you attack the disease with precision based on what's most relevant, based on their, as I said, genetic makeup more often than not, as opposed to at the protein level. And so in terms of the diagnostic tests themselves are the one that essentially enable you to figure out, well, what's happening? What is the disease that person have at the genotypic level? And then like the therapy is ultimately, well, based on this genotype that person has, how it is that you can now tailor the type of treatments and the drugs that the people are going to be receiving. And it's interesting. This is really one of the reasons and one of the key challenge in my mind for precision medicine adoption is not only reimbursement, which is the obvious one, but also, education of the physicians and the doctors, because many of them, they just care about patient outcome ultimately. They look at the phenotype, they give the patient a drug, and they have decades of experience knowing that, well, I've seen a patient very similar to that person in the past, and that treatment kind of like worked. And so they don't really care about, what's happening here at the molecular level and the result of that test, unless it really affects materially the outcome for the patients.
Yeah. I want to come back to you've now mentioned reimbursement and physicians. And so actually let's come back to some of the other places where we're seeing precision medicine lean into this. So providers and payers, right, are two of the major stakeholders. Then of course we have, as you mentioned earlier, we have drug companies, pharma companies, right, have to invest in this. And then of course the diagnostics and tools providers. These are very different stakeholders whose maybe economic incentives aren't always aligned. Can you just describe for us a little bit the decision landscape or the forces at play? I like to describe it almost like it's one of those gaming dice from Dungeons and Dragons with like 20 different sides, right? And you have to kind of hope that they all line up. How do you think about that from the DeciBio lens in terms of advancing your mission, but also trying to persuade people?
So if you think about the patient journey in some sense, the diagnostic is in some sense the gateway, right? And it defines the patient population. Pharma, as we discussed, brings in the therapeutic payload. The payers determine access and affordability. The providers are the one who actually implement. They're the implementer. They're the one who actually make sure that like the patient actually receives the therapy. And the tech companies, there are a number of tech companies now that are increasingly involved as data enablers that I think are quite important. And each of these players are actually quite critical, and they play very complementary roles. In terms of your second question about how it is that they align, they align when it comes to improving patient outcome and reducing waste. Everyone wants to avoid the trial and error treatments. So they align around the concept of value as well, even if the definition of value actually quite differs between the different stakeholders. And unfortunately, there is actually quite still a lot of misalignment, often when it comes from different incentives or different time horizons. Diagnostics companies, they just struggle to prove ROI when their product is upstream of the cost savings. And payers often wait for long-term data while innovators need early adoption to survive in some sense, right?
No, that's very astute. I'll tell you some of the things we hear in the industry. So my company builds AI algorithms that can serve both as kind of therapeutic intelligence tools for pharma, but also the actual algorithms at the heart of a diagnostic device. So we work with both of those sides. And of course, we collaborate with clinicians, right? Because we need their input. We want access to data and so forth. And we've yet to wander into the payer landscape. But what we hear is exactly what you're saying. Diagnostics companies, they don't want to build a test until there's a market for it, right? They don't want to invest in building something that has all this risk, both risk in terms of approval, regulatory approval, but also reimbursement until they know the path. Pharma companies love the translational therapeutic intelligence piece, right? They want to know, they want their trials to be successful, but I feel like most of them think a diagnostic may limit their market, and so they're nervous about having a CDX. The payers, I don't know, we haven't talked to them, but it seems like there's a lot of penny wise, pound foolish attitude towards, we're happy to spend $1 million a year on an expensive drug that doesn't work, but we're not going to spend $5,000 on a test that would tell us if it works. And the providers, again, I think their hearts are in the right place, but they're overwhelmed. There's so many drugs they could choose, so many tests they could choose. It's a matter of education. So is anything I said wrong? Like, what's the pushback to those? How do we get over those sort of barriers of adoption?
I agree with everything you just said, and I think you're right that the payers and providers can be more skeptical. The payer want hard evidence that precision medicine actually saves money, and that saves lives. The providers may resist the added complexity unless the workflow are clearly improved. And the way to counter this, I think, is with real world evidence, and economic modeling and case studies that tie these clinical actions to actual measurable impact. I think that's what it comes down to. But really, one of the key issue that we touched on here with for diagnostic companies that represent the bulk of our clients right now is that the business model is just fundamentally broken for diagnostic firms. And the space is becoming more and more uninvestable. And it's a real issue, and it's a real shame because they just, as I said, can't capture the value that they provide. And so many of these tests are critical. We must find a way to to essentially get this test paid for, this type of test paid for, because they're just so critical in terms of patient outcome.
let's talk about the diagnostic business model and the ways it's broken and what a better model might be. So what is today's business model that doesn't quite work? And if you could just shake up the system and reset it, like how would it work better?
So the way that the model works right now is, as you said, like there is a test that gets developed, and then you have to fight to get that test being reimbursed. And typically, the way that the payers actually think about reimbursement is cost plus, and it is in some sense our fault. Like if you look back like 20 or 30 years when these tests were being offered, because many of these companies have scientists as opposed to doctors or lawyers at their head. They think about, well, this PCR only cost me $5. So if I sell it for 10, I can make money, but it's just not the case. Your COGS have to be in a 10% range in order for the entire business model to work. So I think that this idea of shifting from cost-based pricing to value-based pricing is something that's important, and obviously something that the payer resists a lot, especially in the US, where the insurance that most people have is actually tied to the employer, as opposed to being tied, like the kind of like healthcare systems that exist in Europe, which are quite different. So I think this is really like the business model of today is the one that doesn't really quite work. And the way that the business model should work in the future is, as I said, trying to find a way to help people understand that these diagnostic tests actually have value, and trying to think about whether the actual pool of monies that we can actually get, right? So the payers are clearly a pool of money. So you have to demonstrate with some form of, like economic studies that this type of test is actually worth it. Pharma has money, but, they already pay for some of the CDX right now to make sure that there's access to the drug in some geographies. They don't like it. And finally, maybe patients, actually, we need to find a way to make people realize that if you're willing to pay $10 for a Frappuccino, maybe you can actually put that money aside, save that money, and pay $100 once in a while in order to do whether it's, I'm not saying whole genome sequencing, you don't need that on a yearly basis. They're trying to think about how it is that you can actually save some of that money for actually healthcare, if you can afford it, obviously.
Yeah, almost like healthcare savings accounts or something, right?
Exactly. Patients are increasingly important stakeholders in this ecosystem. So I think that we might actually start to see this. I don't know if you've done some of these tests yourself, but I've done actually quite a few myself now. Whether it's Prenuvio, like this company that does the full body MRI. I was like, just curious. Try to see what happens when you take on the test. Back in 2015, I did the Understand Your Genome from Illumina. Obviously, like this type of behavior it's expensive, right, to do it, but at the same time, it can pay dividend in a very long term, right? And I'm convinced that the money that you invest understanding your health and staying healthy is money really well spent.
I hope you're enjoying my conversation with Stéphane Budel. As Steph and I have discussed, stakeholder alignment is absolutely critical to realizing the value of diagnostics-driven care. At Genialis, we are working to connect the dots between novel drug development and clinical practice by developing biomarker algorithms that scale from early drug R&D all the way to the point of care. Join me on May 22nd for a live webinar hosted by Tempus AI and their SVP of Cancer Genomics, Justin Guinea. We will explore how transcriptomic data is transforming oncology drug development. You can register through the link in the podcast episode description. Later this month at ASCO in Chicago, we'll present an abstract, also with Tempus, predicting response duration and identifying treatable mechanisms of resistance to KRAS inhibition. Follow me and follow Genialis on LinkedIn to keep up with the latest and greatest. And please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to meet us in person at any of these events, reach out at biomarkers@genialis.bio. Thanks, and now back to the conversation. Well, something you said at the very outset of our conversation was you said we have a sick care system, not a healthcare system. And that, I think in the US, that's certainly true. I'm fortunate that through my work and my wife's work, we have good insurance. So my preventative screens are covered, right? I just turned 45. I had my first colonoscopy as a preventative screen. Luckily, it was clean. But, cancer, especially where precision medicine has a foothold, is best detected early. Let's just put it that way, right? If you're going to have a chance. So let's talk a little bit about how, I'm inspired to talk about this because if patients could have more access to screens early on, right? I think we could make a real dent in some of this, and healthcare would be cheaper over the long haul if you catch it earlier, right? So, what are some of the technologies and things that you could imagine becoming more routine?
Yeah, so that I think this is actually what you just mentioned here with cancer is the perfect example and the role that technology can play in precision medicine in improving patient outcome. I think early cancer detection is the poster child example because, as you said, the prognosis for a cancer patient actually ties to the stage of diagnosis, not the therapy you go under. If you catch cancer in stage one, you're gonna be fine. If you catch it in later, you're gonna be in trouble, right? So really the technologies right now that people are evaluating are, next gen sequencing is certainly one that is, all the rage right now. There was obviously a lot of hype and excitement around Grail. If you can do a single blood draw, pay $1,000 and get, screened for 50 cancers, it'd be absolutely phenomenal. And I think this is still the holy grail, no pun intended. And I think we're gonna get there. Yeah. But in the short term, the way we're gonna get there over the next decade or so, in my mind at least, is we actually gonna start with something like Garden Health Shield test, right? So they launched last year. I think they reported something like 6,400 tests in Q4 last year, and they already planning on having 10x that volume in 2025. And here you actually detect only a single cancer, colorectal cancer. So we know that today you can start with colorectal cancer. And sure, like you can actually get the Gallery test and screen for all of these cancer and pay out of pocket $1,000. But I think this is not gonna scale for a while. So you start with single cancer, and I think over time you're actually gonna start to go from single cancer to single cancer plus. And what I mean by or like multi-single cancer is another way to look at it. And one way to think about it is in terms of symptoms or in terms of patient populations, right? So you can look at whether you're diabetic. If you're actually a diabetic patient, there is I think 10x increase in developing pancreatic cancer. There is like a X, multiple increase in developing colorectal cancer. So like depending on like the phenotype or the clinical presentation, you can have like multiple cancers that you screen off based on like, well, that person is diabetic, and as a result, they're likely to develop this cancer.
Based on your risk profile.
That's
Sure.
exactly right. And then the second way you can imagine it is actually more by the physician specialty, where you're going to go see a OBGYN, and as a result, this is when you're going to be screened for, breast, ovarian cancer, cervical cancer, etc. And so your question around the technologies, right now, people are taking largely a single plex approach, meaning that they would be looking at DNA only, right? And what's going to happen in the future, and if you want to be looking at multiple cancer and catch them at different stages, what will most likely happen is we're going to need, like multi-omics type data sets. So looking at DNA and RNA and protein and maybe other things. I don't know if you recall, I think it was back in almost 10 years ago now, Bing, the search engine out of all the potential one, essentially had demonstrated that they can detect one of the cancer. I think it was pancreatic. But pancreatic cancer, something like month before people make their first appointment to the doctor, just simply based on the search terms that they use. So if you go online and you search for indigestion, and a week later you search for indigestion and heartburn, and based on the time that you spend on different links and what you click, it can tell you essentially are on track or behaving as a pancreatic cancer patient. So I do believe that this is one of my contrarian view, is that ultimately precision medicine is going to become so amazing, and we're going to have so many of these wearables and use of phones in ways that the phenotype is going to be dissected at such level that we're going to be able to tie it back to the genotype and say, you behave like a HER2 positive breast cancer patient.
Yeah, this is wild. I didn't know this big example, and immediately, like, you can start to see the potential just because of the sheer volume of. I mean, this is real. This is real world data, right? We struggle so hard. So many companies invest so much to curate meaningful electronic health record data sets, right? And part of the challenge is it's unstructured, and the physician's notes are complicated. And frankly, I think physicians may miss a lot of patient history because patient reporting is often, like, self-reporting is not captured properly. But what you're describing, this sort of the search bar version of this,
Yeah.
I mean, you could even imagine with like ChatGPT, just the number of people who put in, into Dr. ChatGPT now, they're probably getting tens of millions of real world data points on patient self-reported.
I agree. So my dad is last year spent 6 months in the hospital. He's back home now. He's okay. But I was impressed with ChatGPT. I would be entering a lot of the test results that he had, like the again, the clinical phenotype. And it was able to tell me some of the stuff that the doctors did not diagnose for a day or two. Like it's incredible. It's really incredible how smart it is. And of course, it caveats everything, but I think it's going to be especially impressive when it comes down to, being able to tell you or identify really rare cases, because it can actually see, as you said, millions of data sets across the world. Whereas a doctor, a PCP, there is no way that they would come across a single patient like them.
One of the technologies that seems to really be making a difference and gaining quite a lot of ground is MRD testing, minimum residual disease testing. And part of the value that, or part of why is it's a blood draw, right? And so there are great companies like Natera. Measuring things from blood seems to be a way that we can make it a lot more accessible. Where do you see this going?
I agree 100%. Liquid biopsy is one of the space that we cover very closely and that we find very exciting. And you mentioned MRD, but I'll take a step back. And one of the reasons why people are so excited about liquid biopsies is because you can actually just take a blood draw and you can actually follow a patient across their entire disease journey, whether it's, for example, a cancer journey. So when you're healthy, you can go and take a blood draw and figure out whether you are actually have cancer or not. And hopefully, like every year you do it, and you come back with like a clean bill of health. If unfortunately you develop cancer, you can now do another blood draw to figure out what therapy you should actually be taking, right? And as you mentioned, so now you actually take the therapy, that's for therapy selection. And as you mentioned, there is like the last step, which is essentially monitoring the actual cancer patient. And there is like various monitoring tests that you can actually do over time in order at different step of, whether it's neoadjuvant before people take a therapy, whether it's adjuvant after there's been, for example, surgery, or whether you actually do that when it's at early stage or late stage for cancer patients. So there is like a lot of great opportunities for these liquid biopsy companies. And we do think that they're going to be transformative in a way that you see biopharma adopting it for clinical trial as an endpoint. And you see a lot of the payers now being willing to reimburse this MRD type of assays. I'll tell you one thing that we discuss with a lot of our clients is, although people mention MRD as if it was a single test, the reality is that it's a matrix where you have something like 20 different indications on the x-axis, different cancer types, right? And even a cancer type like breast cancer is actually 3 different cancer types. You have HER2 positive, hormone receptor, triple negative, etc. So you have all of these indications, and then you have the use cases that I mentioned earlier, like neoadjuvant, adjuvant, etc., etc. So if you have 5 use cases and 20 cancer, it's actually 5 times 20 is 100 tests. And so what's happening right now with Natera is that they've essentially demonstrated utility, or I shouldn't say clinical utility, they've demonstrated clinical validity of that test for specific cell in that matrix, but not for others. And so we do believe that this is going to be a huge market that's very exciting and one that's going to have a massive impact on patient care in cancer and in the future beyond cancer.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, liquid biopsy it's also, I think, just in its infancy. And, companies like Grail, which we've talked about, have shown that there's some things you can do for early detection. Other companies like Natera are using it for tracking patient journeys, to make sure the disease doesn't come back. But I think the lesson here is that to gain broader adoption, we need to meet the patients where they are. And so a blood draw is already, every time you go to the doctor, you can have a blood draw, like every annual physical. It's no more invasive than what's already happening. And I think that's part of the key.
And also there is a lot of information in the blood. Like right now, historically, we've been talking a lot about short read and, circulating free DNA as if it was this 100 base pair fragments of DNA floating in the blood. The reality is that there are also long pieces of DNA floating in the blood. There are cells floating in the blood, obviously. There are a lot of different pieces of information you can grab in order to just get a better sense of what's going to happen. And one of the vision that Adaptive had probably a decade ago was this idea of like, if you actually can understand the immune system and create an immune map, you could actually know everything there is to know in a single blood draw about a person's health and disease, because the immune system has a memory, right? Meaning that it knows that 10 years ago you fought tuberculosis or whatever it is, and that right now you're fighting a cold or you're fighting this type of cancer. And so with that single blood draw, if we can have this, what's called the immune map, where you understand when you actually sequence these immune cells, what it is that they were fighting, you can get so much information. So again, this is something that probably ties to the healthcare of the future, is getting as much information as we can from a single blood draw.
Yeah, it's like your health record, but encoded in your immune record.
Exactly.
All right, we're going to come back to ChatGPT in so much as I do want to discuss some of the new digital technologies, but there's one stakeholder we haven't mentioned at all, and I'm curious about both the role you see them playing, but also what's kind of going on now is the regulators. So what do regulatory bodies and policymakers, so we have the FDA, EMA, Asian bodies, but also new rules and laws. How has that helped? How has that hindered precision medicine? What do you think the role for regulatory is in helping move us from sick care to healthcare?
So it's undoubtedly there's going to be a role, right? With that being said, I will say that I was actually glad that this FDA LDT ruling was vacated just last month, I believe it was, because the reality is that it is already really hard for many diagnostic companies to actually make money in the space. And if you actually add regulatory risk on top of all of the risks that they're already facing, like technological, et cetera, and market access, it would have been very difficult for them to commercialize their tests. So the regulators essentially can help by, making sure that they support innovators as they think through what's going to be their regulatory strategy, but also making sure to do that in a way that's not, completely oppressive for startups. Because the large players like the Roche of the world that have built, $15 billion franchise in the diagnostic space can quite easily, not easily, but they can actually navigate this regulatory hurdle. But I think for the smaller companies, it can be just very, very difficult. So luckily, there are other channels that you can have in terms of go-to-market without necessarily starting with clinical. You can actually try to play or work with pharma. Pharma can act as a bridge that enables you to go from research to the clinic. But overall, as I said, I think the regulators, I think, they are in some way an hindrance, but an important one. We cannot have trash tests out there, but at the same time, we cannot have regulators that make it impossible for small companies and innovators to actually launch their test either.
Yeah, I mean, if the test is doing no harm, we need to at least give it a chance to prove its utility.
I agree, and frankly, the other thing is that it's the way that I think the FDA think about it sometime is to say something along the line as well. There is like a couple of these false test results might have a negative impact on the following patients. And it's true, but it's frankly playing tennis without the net. If you don't look at the impact that this test can have, helping or saving lives from patients actually who took the test, and that if that test had not been available, these patients might have died. And to be perfectly frank, if you go 10 years back in time, when none of the next-gen sequencing tests actually were FDA approved, and if any of this regulator or their loved one had cancer, they would all have jumped at the opportunity to take a LDT test. So I think that it's important to, as I said, strike the right balance between, sure, it needs to be regulated, you need rules, but at the same time, you cannot stifle innovation.
And I've heard not even so much from US regulatory bodies, but in countries that have, single payer systems or national healthcare systems, one of the concerns from a regulatory angle, or maybe it's even more of a political angle, is if you give a test that says, biomarker positive, negative for a drug, and the patient's negative, and so they're not indicated for the drug, are you denying them the chance of having a life-saving medicine, right? And so I think, our approach at my company, but I think the approach generally needs to be tests that aren't just yes or no, but tests that are much more informative, that are, so yes, you're indicated for a checkpoint inhibitor, or no, but you're indicated for something else. And I think that next-gen sequencing and some of the newer assay technologies give us enough information that it doesn't have to be binary, right? It's the problem, in my opinion, with the single mutation tests. If you're just doing a PCR for yes, you got a mutation, no, you don't know enough in the negative case, right?
Exactly. And so I do believe that when you look at the tests of the future, because they're going to be multimodal, many of them, there's going to be some redundancy. Whenever you have some analytical error, it can be overcompensated because there is like some redundancy in the system that you address the same question with 5 different analytes. And if you have 4 positive, 1 negative, you can probably trust the 4 positive.
And it can also point you in multiple directions, right? So, I think lung cancer is a great example where there are multiple precision medicines approved, right? For different mutations, different. And so, for a physician, you either need a big panel or just a more comprehensive test that gives you kind of all the probabilities for all the different kinds of drugs?
Yep. No, I agree. I agree. That actually ties into another one of the reasons why, when we discussed earlier, why is it that oncology is like the space where there's been the most traction? It's actually in some sense because it is largely binary. There are exceptions like HER2. Rather than you look at HER2, it's actually notoriously like when you have HER2 low, well, what do we do in these patients, right? So largely in general, like it's a cancer, it's a disease of DNA, and as a result, you have an answer that's yes, no. And when you look at one of the reasons why women's health, for example, has been behind in terms of the adoption of precision medicine with regard to endometriosis, for example, is because these diseases are much more complex and it's much more of a gradient. And there is different presentation and manifestation in across different women, different types of perception of pain, for example. And that's the reason why, although endometriosis, I think, is a disease that affects 1 in 10 women in the States, it takes still sometimes a decade to diagnose, which is crazy, right? And the reason is, in part, that's the complexity of the disease because it is actually analog as opposed to digital.
Let's circle back to technology. And so we've talked about a few. Anyone who listens to the show knows that AI is the pool that I swim in, but I know that's not the only thing that you guys are interested in. You mentioned wearables and other sort of new digital technologies. What are some of the things you're most excited about that you see real potential to make a difference? And again, it could be in cancer or elsewhere. How do we move precision medicine into other indications, other therapeutic areas?
Yeah, so I will agree with you that AI is certainly one that I think is just going to be so transformative that there is a reason why you're excited about it and most people are excited about it is I think there is just no doubt that it's going to be completely transformative. If you think about some of the other technologies, I would say that interestingly enough, some of the technologies that I'm most excited about are exciting because of the impact that AI can have on these technologies individually. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one being, if you look at genomics, for example, we still have no idea essentially like exactly what the genome is telling us, right? And a lot of the mutations or structural variants that exist in the genome, we just don't know what to do with this information. And when you actually layer on AI actually relies on large language model, right? LLMs. And as a result, if you do believe that the genome is a form of a language with 4 letters, you should be able to actually have a lot of leverage into making sense of this DNA and this information that's encoded in the genome. So I do believe that especially with structural variants and long read sequencing, we're going to be able to understand the genome with AI at a level of granularity, which is going to be far beyond what we do right now, which is going to be much more predictive in terms of the type of disease that we are at risk for. So that's definitely like this long read sequencing is one that I think is very interesting, in part because there is additional tools or additional information, sorry, that you can get out of this long read, such as methylation analysis, for example. We don't have to get into the details of that. Another thing that is exciting and interesting is the rise of multi-omics. People really think about genomics, proteomics, cellomics, where you look at cells and tissue. And now you have more and more these 3 things actually merging. For example, in the case of spatial biology, where you can get information about the tissue architecture of the cells, what they express at the DNA level, at the RNA level, even at the protein level, and trying to layer on all of this information and think about what it means. I think it's going to be extremely exciting and give us a ton of insights. What's interesting about this spatial omics platform, as opposed to the genomic data, is that it's actually, as we discussed earlier, closer to the phenotype, right? If you take a biopsy from a patient and you can see what's happening in the tissue and in the protein, you're actually very close to the disease as opposed to what's happening in the DNA. There's probably a lot of things that happen in DNA that just stays in DNA and it just never really get expressed, or there are things that happen in your body that actually prevents, like the full manifestation and the symptoms of what's happening at the DNA level. So I think there is, again, a lot of opportunities for AI to be making sense of these images because AI is really good with images. You look at radiology, you look at pathology. So I think it's going to be one of these things that put us forward. And finally, like if you look at multi-omics alone, but not in the context of spatial, I think there's also going to be a lot of opportunities with regard to identifying signatures for biopharma, right? So when you look at these different complex signatures at DNA, RNA, and protein level, you're going to be able to actually simplify these signatures so that like you can develop new drug and new diagnostics to address disease that, as we discussed, go just beyond oncology.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. This is something I'm just back from the AACR conference, right? The big American Association of Cancer Research meeting. And it's interesting because there's every year you see this progression. If you go to the academic posters, you see kind of the latest and greatest, coolest new technologies. We did multi-omics, everything, a full stack from spatial proteomics all the way down to the genome, every data layer, et cetera. And as you work to then the company posters, you have some of that, right? Especially in early discovery. And as you work towards the diagnostic end and the commercial end, the data that you're ingesting almost necessarily becomes a little bit simpler, right? It has to be something you can routinely collect from patients in a global phase 3 trial, right? Like then you end up getting back to like maybe it's the digital PCR. And so what I'm excited about over time is as we get better at modeling the interactions of all these data layers, right? We have companies like Tempus and Oken and others that are building these huge foundation models on these giant data stacks. We could then figure out how to interrogate those models with a truly commercializable analyte, right? So maybe it's just an H&E stain slide that you're now inferring the entire stack of molecular biology, the whole central dogma captured in an H&E slide, for example. And that's sort of where I see this going.
I agree. One more thing I'll mention here is I don't know if you know D.A. Wallach, who is an investor at Time Bio Ventures.
Yeah, sure. Time Bio, yeah.
Exactly. And so DA gave a talk, I think it's now probably a year or two old, about how to streamline, not streamline, how to stream medicine. And it's fascinating talk. And so what he said is because he comes from the music industry, it used to be a time where the actual the actual artist and the listener were very far from each other. And there is all of these various stakeholders who actually make money in the system. The system is actually very messy. And then Spotify came in and bam, they actually essentially streamlined all of that stuff so that now the artist and the listener actually almost are like just directly connected, right? And you want to listen to this artist and that artist get paid for it. Like it's actually much more streamlined. And the point that he's trying to make is that we need something similar in medicine, where when you look at all of the stakeholders right now, everything's a mess. Can we actually have a Spotify where everything becomes streamlined, everything makes sense, and we don't have like the current systems that we have, which is frankly just too convoluted?
Yeah, I mean, in some of my conversations, for example, with Jennifer Goldsack from Digital Medicine Society, she points out it's a $4 trillion industry. So I agree with you. I think there are a lot of people in there who have their hands out, their wallets out, to take some of that money out without creating value. Maybe we can kind of steer the conversation here to end up. How do you see? It seems to me the most important thing to getting precision medicine to be medicine, right? Just all of medicine's precision medicine. I think the technology will get us there, but I think what we have to do is prove value to each stakeholder. So maybe some parting thoughts on what you think the future is in terms of proving out the value of this, right? So that you're only in the system if you're adding value, right?
Exactly. So I think that it's interesting that I feel like the space is in some sense being treated in a way that's quite unfair right now, where there is still question about the value that these tests actually provide. And when you look in precision oncology, the reality is that there are millions of tests now that have been done in order to help cancer patients select the right therapy. And I don't think that we talk enough about it and that we get credit for these tests actually being done now on a yearly basis. There's probably north of 1 million tests being conducted. Um, Now, the next one is maybe when you look at the NICU and what's happening in like with the fast sequencing of some of these babies that come out and they're blue and you need to figure out the seizing, and you're like, well, what's happening to that baby? So like essentially like trying to continue to build these success stories where you can just demonstrate the value that it has and the impact that it have on the health of these patients and the actual economic value that it has. I think a lot of it is just really communication when it comes down to it. And being able to just demonstrate to every single one of the stakeholders, most notably the payers and the providers, that this is just the way forward. I think, as I said, people kind of know that it's kind of the future, but right now there is a bit of resistance because this just healthcare is a very big ship, right? And so it's a very hard one to actually steer one direction of. It's a very big ship with a very small rudder. And it's a very hard one to be steering in the right direction. But as I said, I think ultimately it's going to come down to dollars and cents.
Well, Steph, thank you for your insights today, and thank you for the work that you and DeciBio do to improve outcomes and help prove out the value across the industry. I really appreciate it.
Of course, yeah, thanks. It was fun to be here.
This has been another episode of the Talking Precision Medicine podcast, brought to you by Genialis. Hopefully by now you've subscribed to the show, but if not, go ahead and click that subscribe button and leave us a review. And please do pay us a visit at www.genialis.com. That's www.genialis.com to learn more about how AI is transforming precision medicine. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.